Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a topic today that I know a lot of you have been asking about, the Holy Land.
Mm-hmm.
And we got this really fascinating transcript from a History Channel documentary.
Yeah, it's an amazing topic.
It really is. So
Um,
much history there.
so much history, so much faith, so much
Like
conflict.
outside.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's almost this I don't know, this this incredible irony that this land that's described as like flowing with milk and honey
right.
has been a battleground for centuries.
It's geographically actually a really small area.
Yeah.
Think New Jersey.
Yeah.
But it's such a focal point for three major world religions:
Yeah.
Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Right. And so this is kind of the core of what I wanted to explore with you is this idea of, is the Holy Land truly a divinely promised place?
Correct.
Or is there something more to the story?
Yeah. Well, I think to understand the complexity of it, we have to start with the foundation of it all, really the Old Testament narrative.
Okay.
And the story of Abraham is central here.
Yeah, and this idea that God promised Abraham's descendants this land.
Exactly.
And the documentary actually quotes it as the land between the river of Egypt and the Euphrates,
Yeah.
which is like, that's a big chunk of the Middle East.
Yeah.
It's not just like modern day Israel.
No, it's not a small area at all.
No.
And it's not just about the land itself. I mean, you have the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of his son Isaac
Right, on Mount Moriah.
on Mount Moriah, which is, a hugely significant event.
That's a tough one.
Yeah. Well, it is a tough story.
Yeah.
But for Judaism, this event really solidified Mount Moriah, which is now known as the Temple Mount, as the holiest site in their faith.
Yeah.
But it's also where the Dome of the Rock is, which is a key site for Muslims.
Right.
So you already have this overlapping of claims, even within the Old Testament narrative,
Yeah.
within that foundation.
Yeah. Right. So
Yeah.
you've got this kind of competing narratives already set up
Right.
from the very beginning.
Yeah. And then you bring in the story of the Exodus.
Right. The Israelites enslaved in Egypt.
Yeah.
Moses parting the Red Sea.
Right.
40 years of wandering in the desert. It's
Exactly.
all very dramatic, very cinematic.
Yeah.
But, one of the things that the documentary points out is that there's actually a pretty significant lack of archaeological evidence
Yeah.
to support this narrative
Right.
as it's presented in the Bible.
Yeah, the absence of evidence isn't necessarily the evidence of absence, though.
What do you mean?
I mean, there could be lots of reasons why we haven't found archaeological proof.
Like what I'm picturing, like archaeologists out there sifting through sand dunes, hoping to find like a fossilized chariot wheel.
Well, I mean, that would be amazing
Yeah.
if we found something like that. But
Yeah.
think about the nomadic lifestyle of the Israelites.
Yeah.
They weren't building grand monuments or cities during that journey.
Mhm.
Their material culture was likely pretty simple,
Yeah.
and so it makes it much harder to unearth after,
Millennia.
thousands of years.
Yeah, it's not like they left behind pyramids.
Exactly.
Right.
But
What about...
But I was going to say, what about the sheer number of Israelites that are
Well,
mentioned
yeah.
in the Bible?
But that was my next question.
Right, we're talking about 2.5 to 3 million people.
Yeah.
Which, given the probable population of Egypt at that time, seems pretty improbable.
Yeah.
So some scholars suggest that maybe the Exodus, if it occurred, was a much smaller event
Okay.
than depicted in the Bible.
So maybe it's more of a migration of a smaller group.
Possibly.
And over time, that story grows into this grander...
Exactly.
Fuzzy.
And it's also worth considering that, history is written by the victors.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
religious narratives are no exception.
Right. They're trying to tell a particular story. Yeah. So let's move on to something that I think really captures the imagination, which is the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
It's like the holy grail of
Right.
biblical relics.
Exactly.
And the documentary really emphasizes this obsession with finding it.
Well, I mean, the Ark, as described, was this mobile symbol of God's presence.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
housed the Ten Commandments.
Right.
And then it disappears after the destruction of Solomon's temple.
Right.
And that just fueled countless theories,
Yeah.
and expeditions, and...
Okay, but why is it so important?
Well, for a lot of people, finding the Ark would be seen as this concrete proof of the biblical account.
Okay.
So
it would validate...
it would validate the Israelites' claim to the land.
Yeah, so it's like this physical manifestation of faith almost.
Right. And the documentary even quotes this scholar who says if they could see it somehow that would prove God's will in this world.
Right.
So it's like this tangible thing that they
Yeah.
need to see to prove
Yeah.
what they believe.
I mean, is that really what faith is all about, though?
That's a great question. And I think it's a question that theologians and philosophers have been struggling with
Yeah.
for centuries.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, these tangible relics, these objects,
Yeah.
provide this concrete link to their beliefs.
It's a way to connect
Just something bigger than themselves
Yeah.
in a more immediate way.
So even though there's this lack of like definitive proof for some of these events,
Right.
the search for these objects
Right.
continues to drive faith and fascination with the
Right.
Holy Land.
Yeah.
But it's not just the Old Testament narrative, right?
Yeah.
You have Christianity,
Right.
which, despite not having like a specific promised land mentioned in the New Testament,
Right.
also lays claim to Jerusalem.
Absolutely. I mean, the life and death of Jesus in Jerusalem
Yeah.
makes it a central location
Okay.
for Christians.
So again, it's this idea of place being so central
Right.
to these religious beliefs.
And similar to the Ark of the Covenant, you have these relics that are associated with Jesus. Pieces of the true cross, the Holy Grail,
Right.
all of these things further solidifying the importance of this location.
It's interesting that that need for physical proof seems to continue,
Yeah.
even into Christianity,
Yeah.
right? And the documentary mentions the Church of the Holy Sepulchre,
Yes.
which is built on Jesus's supposed crucifixion site.
Right.
And the irony is that different Christian sects
Huh.
are fighting for control within the church.
It's like
It's wild.
even within the same faith,
Yeah.
disagreements and conflicts
Yeah.
can arise over these really symbolically charged locations.
So again, we see this theme of conflict.
Yeah.
But so far it's been like within Judaism, within Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
But now we got to talk about Islam.
Yeah.
Islam's entry into this whole narrative.
I mean, it seems like every major religion has a stake in this land.
It really does.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
And they're all connected, back to that same patriarch,
Right.
Abraham Islam, through Ishmael, Abraham's son by Hagar,
No.
traces its lineage back to him.
Right. So even though Islam enters the picture later historically,
Right.
it's still tying itself back to this foundational figure.
Absolutely. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have the foundation stone
Yeah.
on the Temple Mount, where Muslims believe Muhammad ascended to heaven,
Right.
which further links Islam to the same location.
It's like this one piece of land.
Yeah.
The Temple Mount is
Yeah.
so central to all three
It really is.
religions.
It highlights that intertwined nature
It really does.
of these Abrahamic religions.
Yeah, and it makes you think, like, is the Promised Land
Yeah.
a strictly geographical concept, or could it be something more symbolic,
I know.
something spiritual, a state of being?
Yeah. That's an interesting way to frame it.
Yeah. And speaking of symbolic,
Yeah.
and maybe even apocalyptic,
Okay.
we got to talk about Armageddon.
Yep.
The documentary mentions this concept of this final battle between good and evil,
Right.
which is common to all three faiths.
Yeah. And the book of Revelation identifies Armageddon,
Okay.
or Harmageddo
Harmageddo.
in Hebrew, as the location for this battle.
It sounds like something straight out of a prophecy.
It does, doesn't it?
What is the significance of this place?
Well, the documentary describes Megiddo as this beautiful, peaceful valley.
Okay.
It was a strategically important city in ancient times,
Okay.
guarding access to the sea.
Okay.
It's seen empires rise and fall,
Mhm.
witness countless battles.
Right. So it's got this history of
Yeah.
conflict.
Exactly.
It's not about what it looks like now,
No.
but more about what it represents.
Exactly. It's symbolic.
Yeah.
It's a representation of conflict throughout history.
Okay. So then what is it
Yeah.
about these beliefs that
I mean,
makes them?
According to the documentary, a lot of Jews and Christians believe that the temple in Jerusalem has to be rebuilt
Okay.
before this final battle can occur.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So this belief has fueled all these movements and
Yeah.
discussions about rebuilding the temple.
But wasn't the temple destroyed by the Romans?
It was,
Way back when.
yeah, back in 70 AD.
Yeah.
But the documentary reminds us that once a spot is deemed sacred, it's always sacred.
Right. So the location itself
The location.
still holds that power.
It doesn't matter if the structure is there or not.
So the very act of rebuilding the temple on that site
Right.
is seen as like this catalyst.
Yeah.
Some believe for this apocalyptic event.
Wow.
That's a really complex interplay of prophecy, religious conviction,
Yeah.
and political motivations.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these beliefs about like the end of times
Yeah.
are so tied to like physical locations in the Holy Land.
Yeah.
It adds another layer to this whole promised land thing.
He does.
It's not just a place of inheritance. It's
Right.
not just where you came from.
Or a place of origin.
But it's also potentially...
the setting for this world-altering event.
It really makes you consider the weight of history.
It does.
And belief that's concentrated in this relatively small area.
Yeah, I mean, what we see in the Holy Land is like this microcosm.
It is.
Of this larger human struggle.
Yeah, it's this desire for belonging.
Yeah.
For purpose, for connection.
Yeah.
To something greater than ourselves.
That's a story of faith and conflict and this search for peace.
Yeah.
All playing out on this global stage.
Absolutely.
And it's that search for peace that seems even more significant.
It does.
When you consider this potential for conflict on such a massive scale.
Absolutely. And the documentary highlights that tension perfectly.
Yeah.
You know, on the one hand, you have these deeply rooted beliefs about this divinely ordained land.
Yeah.
A place that's chosen for a specific people.
But then on the other hand, you have the reality of multiple groups.
Right. With all their own claims and interpretations.
Yeah.
All vying for control and recognition.
All in the same space.
In that same space.
Yeah, it seems like an impossible situation.
It does.
Like, how do you reconcile those things?
Exactly.
But the documentary ends on this note of hope.
It does.
Suggesting that the Promised Land could also represent a state of mind, a way of being.
Right. It challenges us to think beyond just the physical boundaries.
Yeah.
And consider this deeper meaning.
So what if the real Promised Land...
What if it isn't...
a geographical location.
But like a state of peace and understanding.
Yeah, something that we strive for.
Yeah.
Regardless of our faith.
Collectively, it's a powerful thought.
It is.
Instead of fighting over this piece of land, what if the goal is to find that inner peace?
That sense of connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That allows us to coexist harmoniously.
That's the real challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
To move beyond those divisions.
Yeah.
And find that common ground.
In our shared humanity.
Exactly. It's almost like the Holy Land is this microcosm.
Like a testing ground for this idea.
Yeah. And if we can achieve that there, in a place with such a long...
with all the conflict.
Complicated history of conflict.
Yeah.
Maybe it can serve as an example for the rest of the world.
That's the hope.
Yeah.
That by understanding the history
and
the beliefs that shape this place, we can find a path toward a more peaceful and just future.
Yeah.
Not just for this region, but for all of humanity.
I feel like this has been such an eye-opening journey.
It has.
From these ancient stories of Abraham and the Exodus to the rise of Christianity and Islam, the quest for these relics and meaning.
Right.
The Holy Land is like this tapestry.
It is.
Woven with these threads of faith, conflict, and this enduring search for peace.
It really is.
It's a reminder that even in the face of these seemingly insurmountable challenges, the human spirit continues to strive for connection, for meaning, and ultimately for peace.
And what's fascinating is that even with all the scholarly analysis and historical research, there's still this element of mystery, of the unknown that surrounds the Holy Land.
And I think that's part of what draws people to it, right?
It is.
This desire to understand, to connect with something larger than themselves.
Absolutely.
Whether it's through pilgrimage or archaeological exploration or even just like a deep dive into these stories and beliefs.
Exactly. People are drawn to this place in search of answers.
I think that's what makes this deep dive so compelling.
It is.
It reflects that very search.
It does.
We've explored these historical narratives. We've questioned the archaeological evidence.
We've delved into the different interpretations of these events and concepts.
But ultimately, it's up to each individual to grapple with these questions and find their own meaning in this story.
Yeah.
You've mentioned this idea of individual interpretation a few times.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think it goes back to this question that we've been pondering throughout this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
Is the Promised Land a physical place or a spiritual ideal?
Right.
If we consider it solely as a geographical location, then we're kind of inevitably drawn into these conflicts over boundaries, ownership, and historical claims.
But what if?
But if we open ourselves to the possibility of a more symbolic interpretation, then the Promised Land can become something much more personal and transformative.
So it's not necessarily about claiming a piece of land, but about finding that sense of belonging.
Yeah, that sense of purpose.
That connection.
That connection to something greater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that that promise can manifest.
Can manifest in different ways.
Yeah.
For different people.
Right. For some people, it might be a physical journey to the Holy Land.
A pilgrimage.
A pilgrimage to connect with their faith.
Exactly.
For others, it might be a much deeper...
Yeah, like a deeper exploration
on their own beliefs.
On their own beliefs, yeah.
And for others still...
It might be a commitment to building a more just and peaceful world.
Right.
One that reflects the values
that
they associate with that promised land ideal.
It's like we're being invited to look beyond the surface.
We are.
For find our own personal connection.
To that powerful, enduring concept.
Yeah.
And I think that's the ultimate takeaway from this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
The promised land is not a static concept.
Right.
It's this dynamic and evolving idea.
It's a story of faith.
It is.
It's a story of history.
Of human struggle and aspiration.
It's a story that continues to unfold today.
It does.
Challenging us to find our own place.
Right.
Within its narrative.
Exactly.
This has been such a great conversation.
It has.
I feel like I've learned so much.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to you, our listener, for joining us on this journey.
We hope you've learned something new.
And maybe gained a new perspective.
And until next time, keep exploring.
Keep questioning.
And keep searching for your own promised land.
See you next time.
It feels like we've just scratched the surface.
We have.
Of this incredibly complex topic.
It is complex.
There are so many layers to unpack.
Right.
The historical, the religious, the political.
It's no wonder that the Holy Land continues to fascinate and confound us.
It really does. And what's fascinating to me is that even with all the scholarly analysis and historical research, there's still an element of mystery.
There is.
Of the unknown that surrounds the Holy Land.
It's a place where faith and history intertwines in ways
it really is
that we may never fully unravel. And I think that's part of what draws people to it.
I think you're right.
You know, this desire to understand, to connect with something larger than themselves.
It's a very human thing, this desire.
Whether it's through pilgrimage or archaeological exploration or just even a deep dive into these stories and beliefs that have shaped this region.
People are drawn to the Holy Land in search of answers.
I think that's what makes this deep dive so compelling, too.
It is.
It reflects that very search.
We're all searching.
Yeah.
We explored the historical narratives.
Yeah.
We questioned the archaeological evidence.
We delved into these different interpretations of key events.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's up to each individual to grapple with these questions and find their own meaning.
To come to their own conclusions.
Yeah. And you've mentioned this idea of individual interpretation a few times.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I think it goes back to that question we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Is the Promised Land a physical place, or is it a spiritual ideal?
Right.
You know, if we consider it solely as a geographical location, then we're kind of inevitably drawn into these conflicts.
Right. Over boundaries and ownership.
Over boundaries, ownership,
But what if we open ourselves to the possibility of a more symbolic interpretation?
Then the Promised Land becomes something much more personal.
So it's not necessarily about claiming that piece of land.
No, it's about finding that sense of belonging, that sense of purpose.
That connection to something greater.
Yeah, that connection to something bigger than ourselves.
It's about recognizing that the promise can manifest.
Can manifest in different ways for different people.
Right.
You know?
For some, it might be a physical journey to the Holy Land.
Right. A pilgrimage.
A pilgrimage to connect with their faith.
Exactly.
For others, it might be a much deeper exploration of their own beliefs.
Right. A quest for understanding.
And for still others,
it might be that commitment to building a more just and peaceful world.
Right.
You know, one that reflects those values that they associate with this Promised Land ideal.
So it's like this invitation to look beyond the surface.
I think it is.
To find our own personal connection to this concept.
To this powerful, enduring concept.
And I think that's really the ultimate takeaway from this deep dive, right?
I think so.
The Promised Land is not this static concept.
It's dynamic.
But this dynamic,
it's evolving.
An evolving idea.
It's this story of faith, of history.
It's a story of human struggle and aspiration.
Yeah.
And it's a story that continues to unfold today.
It does.
Challenging us to find our own place.
To find our place within that narrative.
Yeah. This has been such a great conversation.
It really have. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you to you, our listener, for joining us.
Yes, thank you for being here.
We hope you've learned something new.
And maybe gained a new perspective.
And until next time, keep exploring.
Keep
Keep questioning.
and keep searching for your own promised land.
See you next time.